Greetings, Star Warriors. Welcome to the Outer Rim. Today I was going to talk about something completely different, but always in motion is the Star Wars news, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk about what recently happened, because I have a somewhat extensive experience with the topic at hand. So, since I have a lot to say, I'm going to just jump right into this. I am right now looking at an article titled, Game of Thrones creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss to write and produce a new series of Star Wars films. I have a lot to say, so I'm just going to jump right into the reading, and I'm going to stop. It's a short article, but I'm going to stop in the middle of it and basically give you a rundown of my experience and what I think about what is being said halfway through the article. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are going from Winterfell to a galaxy far, far away. It was announced today that Benioff and Weiss, creators of the smash hit, Emmy Award-winning television series Game of Thrones, will write and produce a new series of Star Wars films. These new films will be separate from both the episodic Skywalker saga and the recently announced trilogy being developed by Rian Johnson, writer-director of Star Wars The Last Jedi. Here's a quote from Kathleen Kennedy. "David and Dan are some of the best storytellers working today," said Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm. "Their command of complex characters, depth of story, and richness of mythology will break new ground and boldly push Star Wars in ways I find incredibly exciting." Let's take that last statement by Kathleen and see if it sounds familiar. See if it sounds something like you've heard it before, recently. Their command of complex characters, depth of story, and richness of mythology will break new ground, boldly pushing Star Wars in ways blah, blah, blah. I mean, didn't the media and, critics and article writers just get finished telling us that, oh, Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi broke new ground and took Star Wars in directions it had never been before? It took it into the garbage bin is where it took it. I mean, where is Kathleen going to have Benioff and Weiss take Star Wars next? That's what I'm concerned about. But for the moment, let's back up to the first statement she made. David and Dan are some of the best storytellers working today. I mean, she can get away with saying that with people who don't know much about Game of Thrones or don't really pay attention to who and what David and Dan, Benioff and Weiss have done and the way they've done things. But they're not storytellers. They're not storytellers. They take other people's work and they adapt it to TV. Or in this case, they'll be adapting George Lucas's work to films. Now, they may tell their own story in Star Wars, but the world building has already been done for them. That's the point. As far as Game of Thrones goes, they've done nothing but adapt Game of Thrones for television. That's not storytelling on their part anyway. That's storytelling from George Martin's perspective. He's probably one of the best storytellers working today, not David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. That being the case, I'm going to sort of give you a rundown of George R. Martin's history with the Game of Thrones story. The series that he writes is called A Song of Ice and Fire. It's got a couple books in it. He started writing the first one, or he published the first one, I should say, in 1996. The title of that book was A Game of Thrones. The next one, A Clash of Kings, he published in 1998. And the third one, A Storm of Swords, he published in 2000. So he's knocking out a book every 2 years. Considering how large his books are, that's great. That's great time. And they're amazing books too. They're probably his three best, if you ask me. But then, his next book, A Feast for Crows, comes in 2005. So there was a 5-year gap where he was having trouble telling his story. And somewhere between 2000 and 2005 is where I came in to the series and started reading. So I didn't really have to wait that long for that book. I probably started reading around 2003, 2004. And then came my wait. My real wait. I mean, A Dance with Dragons, his most recent book, was released in 2011. That's 6 years. But his series isn't over. And he hasn't released his next book. Now, I'm not here to talk about how good or bad it is that it takes him forever to tell his story at this point in his life. I'm just sort of informing you of how difficult his story has become in the latter stages of the story, okay? So it's become much more difficult to tell this story towards the end of it than it was at the beginning. And now we're going to turn our attention to Benioff and Weiss. So the moment I first heard that they were going to do a show based on the works of George R. R. Martin, I was skeptical because There was always this thing in the back of my mind. What's going to happen if George doesn't release his books fast enough and the show ends up surpassing where he is in his story? And I didn't see any sort of way, at the pace that George writes his books, and considering how many more books he had left to write, how he was going to finish before the show did. So what happened with the show ending up surpassing him after 5 years, 6 years, was expected. It was dreaded, but expected. The first 3 or 4 seasons of the show went off without a hitch. They were as close to perfect as I could expect a television adaptation to be. You know, they left some stuff out, they changed some stuff, but for the most part, I was happy with those. And I kind of still consider myself a fan of the show. I mean, knowing what I know and why things are the way they are, I can still enjoy parts of it. I won't lie, most of those parts that I enjoy have to do with great special effects and CGI. The storytelling is meh, but once they got past the part where George R. R. Martin had yet to write, things started going off the rails. Things stopped making sense. And perhaps if you weren't someone who really got deep into story, then you could enjoy the special effects and enjoy all the death and destruction going on in the kingdom, and even the characters as well. I mean, we've spent 7, 8 years with these characters now, so if you're enjoying the show, chances are there are characters you still like. I'm sure even you, if you weren't paying attention too much to story and plot holes and everything, would still be able to tell that the show was not as good as it was in the first couple seasons. And at the point we are at right now, even people who don't read the books are scratching their heads wondering how David Benioff and D.B. Weiss get from point A to point 100 in the show. They've come to a point where they have ceased to explain their plot holes at all. And I'm not going to get into what their plot holes are, that would take forever, but there are some gaping holes in their story, and it's because George R. R. Martin has not written the part of the story that they have come to in their show. He is slow, but he slaves over his book because the book is difficult to write. Now, I'm not going to criticize Benioff and Weiss too much because they have situations that just cannot be waited upon. Actors have contracts for only so long. Once the contract is up, you may not be able to get said actor over again. So they have to finish this series up. They can't wait for George R. R. Martin. They can't wait. So the series ends up ending the way it ends, as good as it is or as bad as it is. It has to end, and it has to end soon. But I have to establish that they are not storytellers. They're story adapters. They adapt stories, and that's all they've really done. A Game of Thrones was basically their first big gig. They were nobodies before that. So they don't have an extensive resume at all. How Kathleen Kennedy can say what she said about them is just a bunch of hype, trying to get attention off of The Last Jedi and Rian Johnson and Bob Iger and her, of course. I mean, the sad part of this is that this really isn't news. You know, I mean, you could get J.J. Abrams, you could get Benioff, you could get Spielberg, you could get Lucas to come back. But as long as Kathleen Kennedy has the final say on everything and she's running the show and she has as much creative control over this new series as she had over The Last Jedi, the movie is likely to be bad. Unless Disney has reined her in, then it doesn't matter who they get to direct or write this series. Which brings me to another thing. I mean, what do they mean by series? Is it just going to be 2 movies, or is it going to be 4 movies, or is it going to be a trilogy? So I find that interesting. And is it really going to be separate from Rian Johnson's? As far as I'm aware, Benioff and Weiss aren't really directors. I don't find it surprising that they would be working on their series concurrently with Rian Johnson's trilogy. If Disney's going to be releasing a movie a year, they're going to have something to release in between Rian Johnson's films. But Rian Johnson is a director. He's not a writer. Benioff and Weiss are writers. They're not directors. It seems to me that in order to fix their weaknesses, you would want to put those guys together. You don't want Rian Johnson writing your Star Wars trilogy, and you don't want Benioff and Weiss directing. But of course, the article says they're going to be producing and writing, I think. So, you know, they're going to need a director if Rian Johnson isn't going to be the guy doing it. It just goes to show that they are really milking this thing, and quality be damned. Quantity is everything. So I know most of my audience won't be excited by this news, but I know some people will think that this is a step in the right direction. And it may very well be. Maybe they made some sort of deal that they would not come aboard unless they had creative control over this, and Kathleen Kennedy has to back off. but somehow I doubt that. I read an article that was an interview by Ridley Scott a month or so ago, and here's what he had to say. When asked if he was ever offered to helm a movie in the Star Wars franchise, the director said he was too dangerous to ever be allowed and Disney would never hire him because he knows what he's doing. This is a quote by Ridley Scott. I think they like to be in control, and I like to be in control myself. When you get a guy who's done a low-budget movie and you suddenly give him $180 million, it makes no sense whatsoever, Scott said regarding the studio's history of hiring indie film directors. It's effing stupid. Okay, so that's the word from the man. So Benioff and Weiss have handled a lot of money for HBO, but they've never directed anything close to $180 million or $200 million or anything like that. I know that they're going to direct a couple episodes in the final season of A Game of Thrones, maybe even one, maybe two, I don't know. I don't believe they've directed any of the episodes in A Game of Thrones yet. Someone, if you know whether they have, you can correct me in the comments section, but I don't believe they have directed any of the episodes so far. They've written them, but as far as directorial work goes, no, I don't think so. But that hardly matters as they're not going to be directing this series anyway. But anyway, let me finish up this article. It ends, in the summer of '77, we traveled to a galaxy far, far away, and we've been dreaming of it ever since, Benioff and Weiss said in a joint statement. We are honored by the opportunity, a little terrified by the responsibility, and so excited to get started as soon as the final season of Game of Thrones is complete. No release dates have been set for the new films, and there have thankfully been no sightings of White Walkers around Lucasfilm. Now, I kind of want to end this statement by just saying that, or this video by just saying that George R. R. Martin is not overly enthusiastic about the direction that the show has taken the story of A Game of Thrones. So this is a very familiar scenario for us Star Wars fans. George Lucas is not necessarily all that enthusiastic about the direction Disney has taken Star Wars either. So the thing we should be asking ourselves now is, what are we getting into with Benioff and Weiss? I happen to think that Star Wars is getting into more of the same old stuff that we've been complaining about with The Last Jedi these last couple months. They're not necessarily going to care what George Lucas thinks about their series, and they're not going to necessarily care too much, or at least not any more than Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy, what we, the fans of Star Wars, think about what they've done. Before I go, I'd like to express my appreciation for my newest patron, Ollie Barrett. He's been a great member, a great listener to my channel almost ever since I started uploading videos to this channel. So I'd like to thank you very, very much, Ollie. I really, really appreciate your support and all of the activity you have generated on my channel. It's awesome to have you and people like you listening. It really makes all of this worthwhile. It shows me that I am definitely making a difference here, and I'm glad to have you guys come along with me and make a difference as well. Patreon is a platform by which you can donate as little as $1 every month to help support the channel, and I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description box below, just in case any of you would like to learn more about what I'm trying to do here and perhaps contribute to the channel. But it is strictly on a voluntary basis. So, like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and, as always, if you're listening, you are the new rebellion. You are the new rebellion. You are the new rebellion.